Well, hello everybody, this is Tim Green with the Rattle Magazine. Welcome to your Critique of the Week. It's Friday, November 1st. Thanks so much for joining me the day after Halloween. So we might have a short crew on hand. I didn't really announce it as much because I wasn't sure how I was going to handle it, but I am flying in the afternoon, so either we had to do it Saturday or we had to do it early in the morning. So this was a test of how much you're paying attention because I put it in the daily poem email that it would be early, and I made a couple posts on Facebook which don't get to shown to as many people as often. But this is a one-time thing only. We will be doing it today, but then next week we will have no show actually because me and Katie are going to we're going on a little road trip type thing. We're going to give a talk on the future of poetry and digital technology at FSU. And around that, we built in a bunch of readings. So we're going to be on the road. I think we're going to be in Baton Rouge maybe on Friday next week. So no critique next week. An early one today, but didn't want to miss two in a row because I'm flying later this afternoon. So, anyway, great to have all those that we do. Dick Westheimer is here. Amy Dower-Solorzano is here. Zoe Turin, Nikki Fryer, Tom Barlow. We got Dick Westheimer. Joseph Norris is here. Jamal Uden is here. Aaron Bells. First timer. Welcome on board, Aaron. Winston Munn's here. Chelsea McClellan found it. Katie Dozier is, I think she's out riding a bike, listening to this in her ear right now. Be careful riding, Katie, unless she got back. Let's see. Over on Facebook, do we have anybody? We're relying on Facebook notifications, which is never a good idea these days. Facebook really tries to make sure, we got really no one on Facebook. A couple people watching on Facebook. If you are on Facebook, I'll try to look over there occasionally. But this is the Critique of the Week, which is always a lot of fun. We sit back and go through poems, talk about what works and what doesn't. Leave as many comments as you would in the chat if you're here. And we're going to go through the oldest poems in the queue today. If you'd like to participate in the Critique of the Week, all you have to do is go to rattle.com/critique. Rattle.com/critique. You'll find the little submissions link. These aren't random poems we're pulling out of submissions. People are nervous about that sometimes. No, these are folks who wanted their poems critiqued and want to get better with their work. So that's going to help them do. It's that workshop experience. It's really valuable where you get a lot of feedback from people on what actually works in your poems and what doesn't, how they're landing. And so that's extremely valuable to anybody trying to get better as a writer, which we all should do. Let's see, the oldest poem in the queue today is from back in May 17th, and it's Madeline Caffey from Utah, and she's got no special questions. There is a special question field, so if you want to ask us certain specific questions about poetry as you submit for critique, you can do that too. I started out the Critique of the Week really because so many people ask for feedback on submissions. You send submissions out and people say, hey, can I have any feedback? Like, what do you think about these poems? You just replied with a blanket letter, which we have to do because we receive about 500 poems a day. And so this was the alternative to that. If you'd like to share your poems publicly, we'll talk about them publicly. Everybody will learn a lot. You'll get to hear what I think and all that kind of thing. And so it's useful to do. So that was the answer to that. And now anytime anybody asks, I can say, which I did this morning, if somebody's watching who just joined because of that, I said, hey, join the Critique of the Week. That's how you become a better poet. Okay, so anyway, there is a question field. No specific questions here from the first poet up, which is Madeline Caffey. Let's take a look at her poems. She sent two, and that's the other thing, too. If you'd like to share poems, share two. Then we can sort of see if there's certain trends or anything like that, or general advice kind of helps to be able to have two examples, so it's not like a one-off thing that we're looking at. All right, so here's the first poem, Amazing Grace. Amazing Grace. Amazing grace has yet to come to me. Down on my knees, I hear no quiet voice. For their God, I lose me. I sit awake all night, lying in bed, lying to myself. The rainbow inside of me shines so bright, they can't shut me away. For living, no savior of theirs can put out my light. What is love to them? A white gown and a white building? Where does that leave room for me and my rainbow? I have learned if you are told a lie enough times, you will start to believe. Believe that you are unworthy of his love. I will not live my life believing lies. His amazing grace has not saved me. I'm in his jail, and we have never met. So that's the first poem. Yeah, and yeah. So this is Amazing Grace. So one of the things we always talk about are just specific details. And let me show you, actually, I was thinking about this poem, just this one thing. Yesterday, as you know, was Halloween. We had a really busy day. Katie and I also recorded an episode of the Poetry Space, which just came out too at the very end of that very long day. We also did all the Halloween stuff. We did a lot of work stuff. I prepared for Rattle's annual board meeting. So a lot of things going on. But we also had a call for submissions for Halloween poems. Since we had an opening slot, it was a Thursday. Those are days we usually just pull a poem out of the past and add it from the archives into the website. But so we had this call for submissions for spooky type poems, anything like related to Halloween, and we had about 300 people sent poems in, and the one that I picked ended up being a haiku, and this haiku is right here, and it's a great example of what we're going to be talking about in a second. But so here, this was yesterday's poem of the day on Rattle. It's a haiku. His shadow in the kerosene glow. Bat wings. And so I thought that was just a wonderful haiku to capture the whole spirit of Halloween, which is sort of mirthful, but also, a little, frightening too at the same time. And so there's that mix of like energies there. And I thought that was really captured well in this haiku, the way that the shadow becomes bat wings. But the detail I want to notice is how important that word kerosene is. The fact that it's an unusual word and it evokes a lot of things. It evokes the scent of kerosene. It evokes lamps. It makes us think of a whole lot. It's that one detail that the poem hinges on, a very, very specific detail. If it was just his shadow in the glow, bat wings, it wouldn't be nearly as interesting. It wouldn't be nearly as memorable and sticky in your mind. And it's because we're visual creatures. We evolved. We're hunter-gatherers through, thousands of years. We evolved looking for berries in the distance, trying not to step on snakes, making sure we're out of the corner of our eye, making sure there's an eagle not, flying by. And so we have all this visual circuitry, and our brains are mostly visual. I can't remember the percentage, but so much of, the frontal cortex is devoted to visual processing. So we're visual creatures. We have to have these, like, visual things to look at and to hold, to remember something. And so having a unique detail that's a visual really helps the poem. And kerosene glow is really the key to this poem actually working. And so if we look back at the other poem, the problem with the poem has as Amy is saying right here, I think there's a real heart to this poem, but we're missing specificity. And yet we're missing that kerosene glow. Okay, so if that makes sense, we need these like specific details that make the poem connect and resonate. A lot of times when people are early on writing in poetry, they think that being more general is the thing that makes us feel, because you can, if you're broad, if you have like your sort of scope doesn't narrow in on specifics, then we feel like everybody can relate to it because we've all been there and it doesn't really conflict with what we've seen. But that's not at all how our brains work. We have we have these mirror neurons. We try to mimic other people. We're social creatures. We want to see through other people's perspectives. And that specific detail is what lights up all the connections in our neural synapses and makes our brain start firing, and that's what makes poetry actually work. And so having specific details is really the key. And this poem, Amazing Grace, you cannot find a specific detail in here. So that's what we need. That's what we're missing, is that specificity that makes us all connect. So let's see. Let me just say this too, because it's never too early to say this. Because CLAS says, great poem, talking back about this, but I know modern writers don't do 575. But how is it haiku? Well, the haiku has nothing to do with 575. It doesn't actually have to do anything with modern writers. There's no such thing as 575. In the Japanese, they don't count. They count on, they call them, which are mora, which is a time, and it's a time signature, kind of like in music. It's not a syllable. So there was never 575 haiku. It was a mistranslation into English. What we're really doing is sort of short, long, short. But the heart of haiku is the two things juxtaposed together in one single breath. I say haiku is two worlds in one breath, so that's why this is haiku. We have his shadow in the kerosene glow, and then separate from that, bat wings. And so it's that contrast between the two things juxtaposed and smashed together that lights up our imagination. A kind of like mini metaphor in one breath is what you think of as haiku, and that's how it is. So anyway, but back to the poem. So Amazing Grace here, there's a heart here, but we don't know. We have white gown and white building is the closest we get to having any kind of sense of place. We want to hear the story and have specific details about it. That's how we're going to connect and resonate with something. So, yeah. Katie Dozier says, for CLAS and anyone else wondering, Katie Dozier's podcast, which I'm co-host of, it's a poetry space. You can find on Apple, iTunes, Spotify, all that stuff. We just did an episode on haiku not too long ago, so you can find that for a lot more on haiku. As Lisa Seidenberg said, I like a white gown and a white building. Makes me think of church and a statue of Mary. Yeah, and so that is in the whole poem. That is the most specific detail, and that's the one that resonates because it starts to light up our imagination. So we want to add more of that, like actually put us in the place where all this is happening. Let us sort of see how you're experiencing things, and don't try to be general. So read it one more time and note where things are just really generalized and not specific. And that's going to be the key to making better poems. Amazing grace has yet to come to me. Down on my knees, I hear no quiet voice. So, down on my knees, that's an opportunity to show the set a scene. Show where you're at ease. What does it feel like? What are you looking at? What's your forehead leaning on something? What does that feel like? The thing that you're pressing against, the wood of the pew or the end of the bed or whatever's going on. Show us that. Put us in that scene. For the God I lose me. For their God I lose me. I'm not sure about that, the construction there of that. For their God I lose me. I sit awake all night, lying in bed, lying to myself. The rainbow inside of me shines so bright. So what are the lies? Like, we have all these opportunities to get specific and have specific details, but we don't. We don't tell us what the lies are. We don't tell us what the light shining inside so bright is, They can't shut me away for living. No savior of theirs can put out my light. What is love to them? A white gown and the white building. See, that's the nicest line because we have some detail and we can sort of see those, and they're a little bit unusual. Where does that leave room for me and my rainbow? And that's a nice line too. So as, Ali Rowland says, and the rainbow in contrast to the white cloud may be developed. Yeah. And so if we start to, when we start to get specific and sort of create an actual visual scene, then you can really play with that metaphor that's the heart of this poem, which is the contrast of the white church to my rainbow, which is, I interpret that as, LGBTQ type, scenarios. Jamie Thomas says, I'd like to know who the theirs are. Yeah. And it's always specificity is the key to everything, And so anytime there's something like theirs that we don't know what it is, it's important to let us know. We want to hear your story, If you are told a lie enough times, you will start to believe that you are unworthy of his love. I will not live my life believing lies. His amazing grace had not saved me. I'm in his jail, and we have never met. And so I'm in his jail is another interesting opportunity to develop that into a scene that we can see and enter, and then we can experience it. The whole point of poetry, they're these little empathy machines where your breath enters my body. You play me as an instrument, and I get to feel what it's like to be in your shoes, to live life in your breath, because I'm saying the words that you are as the speaker of the poem. And so there's this intimacy to that, and there's this way that we get to connect in a deeper level because I become you briefly. Your voice becomes my voice, and we get to experience that. And so developing that as much as possible is what makes poems actually work. And so I'm in his jail, and we have never met is a good maybe first line of the poem. Maybe that's where we can leap into detail. What does the jail look like? Develop that more. And I think like I said, the whiteness versus the rainbow is a great contrast too. So so that's where to go. Let's see if the other poem has the same issue, and usually they do, which is why we show two. or ask for two. Here's the second poem. No One's Friend. He wasn't really mine to lose, but I sat there with the mourners too. I had never heard a song so grave and cruel. I wonder what it sounded like to you. Sorry, I'm just gonna adjust this a little bit. Sorry. I wonder what it sounded like to you. The February skies dimmed to dark. You took him, left a jar of broken hearts. Years away, but just 6 feet apart. In the arms he holds the angel's harp. Me and you, the murders and martyrs, and all their broken sons and daughters, struggle to stay afloat in the waters of growing up without their fathers. The murders, the martyrs, and me and you, were we all just the cross fool? Bent down on my knees, I just want to say, dear God, that was the last time that I truly prayed. Look down from your sky, Lord, and what do you see? A girl with no father down on her knees. What do you see when you look down from heaven? I see a girl whose dad died when she was 11. You took him, decided that this was his end. Oh God, dear God, you are no one's friend. Yeah. And so, again, this poem has a little bit more detail, especially in the open section. And if you zoom back, you can sort of see, this happens a lot of times in poems, but do you see how there's a certain length to the poem here, where the lines are, even not thinking about the meter, the lines are longer here, and we develop this really nice internal rhyme that I loved. I loved the internal rhymes going on in the first 3 stanzas, but then we slip into this shorter line, and it starts running toward the rhymes, and we don't get the same detail and the same level of interesting content that we did before. And so we sort of, as Winston Munn says, I like the slant rhymes. Yeah, the slant rhymes are great, but we fall into these really short lines that go back to that lack of detail. And so I think this is a poem that really could use revision back to this. Like, can we take these last several stanzas and convert them into this length in maybe 2 instead of 4? So that's the kind of thing, because as we get sort of lost in the rhyminess of that of the later parts, we lose the sense of detail, and we lose the thrust of the poem. So it starts out really strong, though. So No One's Friend is the title. He wasn't really mine to lose, but I sat there with the mourners too. So we have the lose tool, and we have cruel and you. So those are all slant rhymed. It's really nice format. We do the same thing in the next stanza. Anyway, I had never heard a song so grave and cruel. I wondered what it sounded like to you. The February skies dimmed to dark. You took him, left a jar of broken hearts, years away, but just 6 feet apart. In his arms he holds the angel's harp. So it's just wonderful slant rhymes there, and I think there's a really fresh sense of play. Jamie Thomas says there's a lot of beautiful rhythm through some of it. Yeah, there is too, and because we have a little bit of room and we're pushing toward those slant rhymes in the opening section, it allows us to have interesting things come up. In his arms he holds the angel's harp. Especially when you have the rhyme set up is a really nice line. Me and you, the murders and martyrs, and all their broken sons and daughters. Said that martyrs' daughters is a nice rhyme too. And all their broken sons and daughters struggle to stay afloat in the waters of growing up without their fathers. And so up to that point, I think the poem is really beautiful. But then, we're repeating the murders and martyrs. So the murders, the martyrs, and me and you, we are all just the cross. Were we all just the cross fool? And you see how rushed that feels compared to the other lines. I think the poem just took a wrong turn. And I think if we could find some of the content here and just make it maybe even one stanza that's written in the way of the old. Sort of, and you can see it all the time, where a poem is sort of writing itself, and it's really because it's coming from a deeper subconscious part of you, and so the poem feels like it's writing itself for the first 3 stanzas, and then we get more self-conscious about it, probably because we didn't know where to go, and so it ends up being condensed and sort of written toward the rhyme, and so I would just cut all this second half of the poem. and really focus on making one more stanza that doesn't explain everything in like a conclusion kind of way, but pushes your thoughts a little farther and let it sit there. And I think that's the key to this poem. So I think this, I would just cut all this and rework an ending. Amy Dower Solorzano says, I think Jar of Hearts could be freshened up. I can't help thinking of the Christina Perry song, but maybe that's just me. Yeah, I don't recognize that reference, but it is interesting. If you have poems that do reference things, some people are going to notice and some people aren't. That's the way it works. Yeah, Chelsea McClellan too. So I don't even know who Christina Perry is. I'm stuck in. I listen to a lot of modern folk music and 70s rock or 60s rock. So, and Taylor Swift for my daughter. All right, so Winston Munn suggests a good example of how and why to break rhythm is "We'll Go No More Roving" by Lord Byron. Yeah, it's a good suggestion. Okay, well, that's my thoughts for this poem. Let's move on to another. And next up, we have... You can label this one so we know we already replied. Next up, we have Ethan Maguire. And that name sounds familiar. Ethan from Indiana. Again, theflummoxed.com is a website he puts in there. And so here we have 2 poems from Ethan. The first is the 6th December 19. Here we go. 06 December 19. So, it's very fixed in time to have the date be a poem, or the title be a date, I should say. 11 fallen, bullet wounds slowly bleeding, waking up to death at your door is hell, and then hell again. Sirens wail, speeding down the parkway, echoing across a sickly warm December misty morning on the peaceful Emerald Coast. Wherever you see the sinking news, another shooter, another day, another story, another day, ringing shots only ricochet closer. Praying God forgive our human nature, ease our mortal coil, possess we the ability to end these cycles senseless. To market, to buy back our souls, sold when we were young, selfishly furthering our fallen worlds. So that is the first poem of 2. Now, let's talk about titles a little bit. A title is an opportunity to add something to the poem. So it's to set a scene, to make the memorable and something you want to read when you see it in the first place. You see the title at the top of the page. If it's something that makes you want to read the poem is going to be read more. That's just a fact. Another purpose of the title could be to cut against the content of the poem and sort of have a surprising leap in a haiku-like way, So there are different ways of using a title, but we should use a title effectively, And so just having the date here, I think a lot of times you could just have a real title, a full title doing some of that work, and then have the date as a little epigraph below it. And then we know the date, we get that information, which could be useful or, personally significant to the story of the poem. But then we can take advantage of what titles add to the poem too. And so I think, first of all, that's something I would do. I would find a title, that does something. A great thing to do, what Kim Stafford talked about in that Rattlecast, he had 3 specific ways he does it, but iterate, what could I do for a title that's, he says, a long one, a short one, and a weird one. You could have just read the poem out loud, and what image comes to your mind is the way you can do it. But if you iterate and sort of list different titles and then see which one sort of resonates with you, I think that's a great way to do it. And so here I would do that after the poem, like come up with a bunch of different titles and see what actually works and makes you feel a little bit, and then make that the title. Okay, so going into the poem, I think the poem too starts out with a little more detail, and then it gets into more generality and doesn't really know where it's going, I guess, in general. So the poem, I think, starts out pretty well. So here we go with this. I should say, too, if you're enjoying this, make sure you do click the like button. It is a strange early show, so we don't have a lot of viewers. But if we get more likes, then maybe more people will watch it later. Anyway, here we go. The 6 December 19. 11 fallen, bullet wounds slowly bleeding, waking up to death at your door, hell, and then hell again. So the death at your door is a bit of a cliche. There's some cliches throughout the poem. And the problem with cliches is that they're sort of mental chunks that don't have the stimulating effect of the metaphor anymore. They've lost their metaphor because it's become so routine that we see it as a whole unit. And so, like raining cats and dogs, it used to imagine actual dogs falling down and drops that big, and it was a very visceral image. And now if someone says raining cats and dogs, you don't really think about it. You just think about it raining a lot, and it's not visceral and not memorable. And that's what happens with all cliches. It's a process of transferring that connection from your right brain, the holistic side, to the concrete left. And once it gets concretized, it's not interesting anymore. So just death at your door is a cliche. There's a few throughout there. But at least we have 11 fallen, bullet wounds slowly bleeding. It's an intense detail image, but we have the detail of it 11, and we're sort of ready to enter the poem because we know what's going on right away, or sort of what's going on. Sirens wail speeding down the parkway, echoing across a sickly warm December misty morning on the peaceful emerald coast. So we get a bit of a scene painted there. We have the sirens, we have the wounds, and then a bit of a sense of where we are. Wherever you see the sinking news, another shooter, another day, another story, another day, ringing shots only ricochet closer. So that's it, we're talking about, Amy Dower-Solorzano says, I think the second stanza is a bit heavy on adjectives. I think poet can maybe use more parts of speech to render the same image of the sickly warmth. And so, I agree too. I mean, adjectives are the weaker way of describing things. Showing it with nouns and sort of concrete things. Again, it's all about creating that visual effect where we can, enter into the poem. The topic of the poem, because we're talking about this stanza here, wherever you see the sinking news, another shoot, another day, another story, another day, ringing shots only ricochet closer. I'll read the rest of the poem. Praying God, forgive our human nature, ease our mortal coil. It feels like, we sort of set the stage for the poem and then didn't quite know where we were going to go with it, and so ended up in a generalizing position instead of entering more deeply into the scene in what's going on and exploring that more. So praying to God, forgive our human nature, ease our mortal coil. And the mortal coil is another cliche. Possess we the ability to end these senseless cycles. So if we're really talking about a cycle of things ricocheting closer. And it reminds me of this poem that we published by Molly Fisk. And compare, this is Violence Fractal, talking about the same topic. This is school shootings. Watch how the details sort of swirl in this poem. We never get into that abstract sort of philosophizing voice. We stay within details, and the poem just rings more true and has more resonance because we stay within the concrete. So here's Violence Fractal by Molly Fisk. First, it's locations you've never heard of. Then faraway places you haven't been, then countries you've traveled to, but not that city and not in a long time. Slowly, a tulip unfurling red petals, it's Paris, Rio, Toronto, and Florida, where your grandmother lived, and you flew for a visit, age 12. Frogs on the window screen croaking all night. Las Vegas is just one state over, so far no one you know, but now it's people your friends can name, a daughter's schoolmates, psychologist mother. This week a bike path, a Walmart in Denver where Ellen still lives and your favorite niece, but no one we know shops at Walmart, do they? Soon though, It's only a question of numbers and luck. It will be someone you liked but lost touch with, a boyfriend, a roommate, then someone you love, and then you. And so feel how instead of like philosophizing and getting farther away from the actual scene, what's going on, Molly Fisk in this poem, this is from November 2017, which I don't even know, no idea which of the many shootings this could be, a Denver shooting. But see how Molly stays within specificity, even as the poem swirls away from distances. We have that great image of a tulip unfurling red petals, and then that tulip becomes Paris, Rio, Toronto, and then Florida, and then the Florida goes specific with your grandmother. Feel we stay within the actual story that we're telling, and we don't step back like a narrator. And that makes the whole thing feel much more immediate, and it's saying the same, similar kind of topic, So in this poem, we have that picked up. We're starting there, where we get this, we know it's the Emerald Coast, but then we step back and start philosophizing. It's because we had this concept, and then we didn't, go back to the scene. We sort of swirled out into a different kind of narrator, one that doesn't have as, which someone says it's like a parable, the message delivered in a story. Yeah, Yeah, Tambarlo mentions to market, the children's rhyme seems an odd reference. Yeah. So, but you see the difference between the two. Whenever you're sort of summarizing and saying what the story is about or what we mean and making commentary on it, it's just not as effective as if you're letting the scene speak for itself that you're creating. You're creating this little world, and if you let that little world have its own message, then the message lands a lot more powerfully than if you tell us what the message is about. And that's what happens, I think, with a poem here. Praying to God, forgive our human nature, ease our mortal coil. Like, that's the message that I want to say. That, like, consciously, that's what I'm thinking about sharing with this poem. And so we don't have, like, a hard-hitting feel. We're not connected the whole way through because we're stepped back and we've been removed from it. And so here, staying with the scene we have here, or going back to it, where else can you go? Like, poems, even when they're not narrative poems, they're still a kind of arc, a kind of plot that you move through, and there are kinds of scenes. In the Molly Fisk poem, we talked about that tulip unfurling is a kind of scene. It's a kind of shot, that we could show in this sort of montage documentary we're making, if you want to think about it like that. But we have a sense of showing different things in detail, and that's really a key to making poems powerful and memorable. So so find that again. Don't lose it and speak there. So to market, to buy back our souls is again a sort of generalizing thing, referencing that nursery rhyme too. Sold when we were young, selfishly furthering our fallen worlds. That's the summary of what we were trying to say within the poem. Yeah, Nancy Semanek says, describe some of the 11, describe the scene, go somewhere else. Like, what does this scene remind you of? Like, we need a sense of movement to transitioning to different images and scenes, Okay. Let's take a look at another poem from, again, this is Ethan Maguire. And this one is, I Kidnapped My Poetry. I like the title. See, we talked about, too, with the last poem, the title wasn't really pulling a lot of weight. It was showing the date, and maybe that sets us where what we're talking about. But it's not vivid. It's not memorable. If I saw it in the table of contents, I wouldn't want to read that poem. So it's not doing that kind of work. It's not cutting against in a surprising way what the poem is. It's not adding. It's just not adding anything except for that one detail, which you could add without even making it the title. But here in the second poem, we have a much more interesting title, I Kidnapped My Poetry, which is kind of funny. I don't know where it's going to go, but I'm curious about it. It raises some kind of mystery, and I like that. So it's making me more interested in reading this poem than I was with the last poem. I Kidnapped My Poetry. I kidnapped one of my poems last night, my most flummoxed poem by far, and flung a pillowcase over his head. I slapped him upside the ear once and beat him until red became blue. I tied him up and I flogged him with Billy Collins' garden hose, as Billy himself advised against. Have you ever seen Casino Royale? Like Le Chiffre did in 007, I don't know if I'm saying that right. I pulled out my knife and cut away the braided seat of a wicker chair, and I shoved my poem into it. Then, against all instruction, yet in trying to fulfill all instruction, I bound his hands and commanded he sit in the unupholstered chair no matter what, on threat of death. I retrieved the knotted length of rope, which I always keep inside my glove box for just such occasions when they arise, and I flung that rope with all my might beneath the chair, connecting, torturing my poor fellow's nuts, at least until I had beaten him well, until he was all technicality, all humanity absent. So there's that, and I like the concept of it. It's plays on, it references Billy Collins and plays on that. Is it workshop? Where they wrestle he tries to keep his students from wrestling a poem into a chair and beating a confession out of it or something like that. So it's sort of a reference to that, where his own poem is doing that. And I think there's really nice details, and a good example of what we were talking about with the last poem. Having a sense of movement from scene to scene works really well, and I think so. I think the poem really started out strong. I kidded one of my poems last night. My most flummoxed by far. I like the most flummoxed by far. Flummox is not a word you see very often. Colin Samrick says needs to go a bit further, I think, and that's exactly the thing that I was going to say. Like, it's a great setup, but it didn't really push down as far as it could have. So I wonder where you can actually take the poem, is what I'm thinking as I'm rereading this, and we'll talk about it line by line a little bit. Anyway, my most flummoxed by far, that's kind of a kerosene type word. It's a really nice word that you don't see very often. A flummoxed poem by far, and flung a pillowcase over its head. Nice alliteration, and nice visual too, with the flung and the flummoxed, and then also, the pillowcase as well. I slapped him upside the ear once and beat him until red became blue. I tied him up and I flogged him with Billy Collins' garden hose, as Billy himself had advised against. There's parts in this poem where it gets a little wordy and sort of clunky, and I think this line's a little clunky. Have you ever seen Casino Royale? But here, it's kind of the thing we were looking for in the last poem, but never materialized, which is a sense of moving to somewhere else, surprising. We want to be surprised as we move through the arc of a poem. Every line should be something that sort of pushes farther or surprises and pushes against the last line. And so that we have that here. I had no idea we're going to Casino Royale, which is another movie I haven't seen. But have you ever seen Casino Royale? Like Le Chiffre said, and did like Le Chiffre did 007. I pulled out my knife and cut away the braided seat of a wicker chair. And so cut away the braided seat of a wicker chair is kind of great detail that makes this whole scene that's playing out much more vivid. And I shoved my poem into it. So really great visual. We're sort of personifying, but not at the same time, which is fun. So it really, up to this point, I think the poem's working well, except for the little clunkiness in that line I mentioned. Then against all instruction, yet in trying to fulfill all instruction. So we have this repeated line. This feels like it gets a little wordy. I bound his hands and commanded he sit in the unupholstered chair no matter what, on threat of death. And, the poem was already shoved into it. And there's really not a lot of detail here, so I'm not sure what's added by the unupholstered chair is an interesting detail, but that's the only thing within 4 lines that does anything, and it just sort of repeats. So this is a whole candidate to cut. It really doesn't do anything. The repetition of instruction is strange. I would definitely cut that. It just feels sort of redundant. I retrieved the knotted length of rope, which I always keep inside my glove box. So again, you keep it in your glove box is interesting detail, at least, for just such occasions when they arise. And for just such occasions when they arise is just doesn't add enough to the poem to be a whole line. There's nothing there, saying I keep it in my glove box sort of implies that there's some reason that we don't know. And then we don't expand on that at all. So there's no reason for that line. And I flung that rope with all my might. All my might's a cliche, beneath the chair, connecting, torturing my poor fellow's nuts. And going specifically to nuts is sort of a shift in register and tone. That word. is a sort of a comical type way of referring to that. And so it doesn't really fit with the register of the rest of the poem. So that's another thing. At least until I had beaten him well, until he was all technicality, all humanity absent. I love the all technicality, all humanity absent where it goes at the end. But it doesn't really, as people were saying, doesn't go far enough. Tom Barlow says, I'd like to see the surrender. What does that look like? Yeah. So we ended up, we started with a compelling poem. We were using nice details and sort of creating a scene, and then we didn't go far enough with it and didn't see where that scene might take us. And I like the concept of all technicality, all humanity absent, but I think we can go farther with that. And there's a lot of redundancy in the last second half of the poem. So trimming that out and then pushing a little farther with what would happen after. When you let your imagination run with something, surprising things and interesting things happen. That's where the most things, where the most surprise and interest comes from, is when you're just letting yourself go. As Amy Dower Solorzano says, I think the conceit comes apart a little bit and the final stanza feels a little odd until that great moment of all technicality. Yep, exactly. Yeah. Lisa Seidenberg said, does anyone find it odd that the poem is a he and not an it? That's an interesting detail. It could go either way. It depends how the poem's going to be developed. Is it going to go a little bit farther? And is that going to mean something, But the last line is nice. But the last line, we referenced Billy Collins, and sort of had the same message as that Billy Collins poem that it's referencing. And so, it's sort of not going farther into, what that would be like or something, and pushing into the story and seeing what surprising might come up. Not doing that makes the poem sort of a repeat in messaging for what Billy Collins did and did better. I mean, why repeat something that Billy Collins did in one of his most famous poems? And so, take that and take it farther than Billy Collins did. We had a poetry prompt on the Rattlecast maybe a year ago that was to, how did we phrase it? It wasn't to write an after poem. It was like what actually happens after. And, pushing a famous poem even further, taking the absurdity to even more extremes, or seeing what happens after the events is something interesting. But talking about torturing your poem until all the humanity's been taken out of it, and that's the only thing you do, that's just not enough. It's not adding to the total creative content of the human race, which is what we're trying to do. It's a big thing to ask. It's not easy to do, but we're trying to do that with poems. And where else can you push this one to go farther with it? Okay, that's enough on this. Let's go on to another poem, and I'm going to try to accelerate along because I don't know why I'm going slower than I usually do. Let's see. Here we go. Try to get to at least two more poets before the hour's up. Okay, so this is Carla Homeister from Minneapolis. And she has some general questions. For the first one, is there confusion about the shipwrecks in the night? Are the food and abuse images too muddled? Do they do by a little too quickly? Go by, I think it says. Do they go by a little too quickly? Okay. And then for the second one, title suggestions as a request. Okay. Yeah. Oh, this is a great comment from Amy again. I think I'd enjoy, talking about the last poem, I think I'd enjoy some flourishes of craft knowledge. What does it look like on the page to neuter a poem? What actually happens in the poem that makes it soulless? Yeah, that's a good way to think about that too. Okay, so now on to the next poet, and it's Carla Homeister. And here we go with this one. She holds a butcher knife in one hand and Twinkies in the other, tears streaming as she stuffs the food down. Already she is the assemblage of so many shipwrecks in the night. The dick in her vagina at 7, its own knife. Even the precious age of 12. She felt the urge to slice herself open at multiple points in her body, like a river draining its tributaries, holding its flat and cool against her cheek. This knife is more comfort than kill. So that is the first poem. It is, talking about that, the difficulty of that, the abuse references. It does come, suddenly and shockingly. in the poem, which may be the point. That's something that can work. Let me see. Yeah. Winston Munn's got a great comment. You never see the Grand Canyon if you follow a map through Flagstaff and never leave Interstate 40. Yeah, that's true. Poems have to wander and stray and surprise you. Yeah. Okay. So anyway, self-portrait at 15. And it is tough content, but the world's tough sometimes, and we need tough content sometimes. She holds a butcher knife in one hand and Twinkies in the other, tears streaming. And of course, tears streaming is a cliche. We already talked about those in this episode, but avoiding things. There's sort of two things. There's sort of a melodrama to tears, which is worth avoiding, and then if you are using tears, they have to be in a fresh way, or maybe just in a plain and move on. Because tears streaming and all those kind of constructions are all just things we've seen so much they chunk and they're cliches. As she stuffs the food down, and stuffs the food down is kind of a cliche too. So we had the butcher knife in one hand, the Twinkies in the other is a very vivid image and unusual. But then we had, drift into cliche here. Already she is the assemblage of so many shipwrecks in the night. And so, there was a question about this image. I like the transition to it. I think the assemblage of so many shipwrecks is a great phrase. In the night, I think kind of cuts it off and stifles it, and then we move on. And I wonder if, and it says so many shipwrecks too. So here, it's sort of, I wonder if it wanted to say a whole list of things, and I can imagine a thing where you're listing some things and changing the level of trauma with them, and so that the end is surprising, where it sort of, runs a little further, and every item on the list is more strong until we get to that one. Instead we have so many shipwrecks, but then only one, and in the night doesn't really fit with shipwrecks. So if you want to have in the night, like, why not develop that image more and what the shipwrecks are, what's special about the night. Why did that come up in night and not just shipwrecks in the day? What's the difference? And can we explore that maybe? That might have been an opportunity that we passed by. But then we go to so many shipwrecks in the night, the dick in her vagina at 7, its own knife, which is, I think it's a really strong phrase there, that being a knife. Even at the precious age of 12, she felt the urge to slice herself open at multiple points in her body, like a river draining its tributaries. And so, I don't know, the simile there, like a river draining its tributaries, is, it could be stronger and more interesting. It's not as profound as the rest. Holding it flat and cool against her cheek, the knife is more comfort than kill. And so, we have the poem, we sort of have a setup as Winston Munn says, the butcher's knife makes me think murder, not self-abuse. Cutting self done with a razor or smaller knives, is it not? It also says this poem needs to be unraveled. Yeah, so this is what I was looking for, though. The Colin Sandberg says, I don't know if there's any discovery for the poet that has happened yet. And so, we sort of knew what we were talking about the whole time, and then it ends sort of where we knew that the speaker kind of knew where it was going the whole time and didn't have a sense of discovery in the poem. Dick Westerman says the poem is courageous and full of good images. Yeah, there's several really, really nice ones in the poem, and that's the heart of the poem. Like, that's what works as a poem. And it is courageous, too, to write about this openly. Dick Westerman also likes that opening couplet. She holds a butcher's knife in one hand and Twinkies in the other. And I agree. It's the details like that that really work. And so great detail there. I like the so many shipwrecks. This is a great detail, too. The precious age of 12, what image could we have that shows precious age of 12 instead of saying precious age of 12? She felt the urge to slice herself open at multiple points in her body. I guess the problem with the like a river draining its tributaries, there's something that feels off, I guess, with, if there's multiple slices, I don't know. I think it's interesting, but does it really work? Maybe it does. The problem is the river ends up flowing into like one place, and blood, if there were several points, kind of goes all over. And so it sort of feels like the metaphor is a little off to me. Winston Munn says they're surprised after the first couplet, but then no further movement. Yeah, we stay in that one place. And again, what we're trying to do with a poem and the way they actually work successfully, and just sort of repeating yourself over and over again saying this, but how they work successfully is you build the scene, you create this sort of magical, meditative space, and then you enter it is when you're writing and you surprise yourself with where you're going to go. And it's the subconscious is allowed to speak. And that's where surprise and interesting things come from. And a lot of times we open that space and then just stay right with it and don't sort of follow all the doors that we could and surprise ourselves. And I think that's what's missing in this poem. Although, as Dick said, there's some really good images and it's a very brave thing to be writing about. Amy Dower-Solorzner says there's a courageous brutality here. I do think brutality can be warranted, but I think reactions will vary from reader to reader about whether certain language could feel gratuitous or re-traumatizing. And that's the case too. When you're choosing poems to publish, you have to keep that in mind. The question here, is the poet 15 or an adult looking back? If an adult, could there be some perspective added to the poem? That's a good suggestion too. Just where else can we go? We should always be thinking, like, where can I leap to from here? Chris Anderson, the guest not too long ago, talks a lot about leaps in poems. And, in Haibin, the haiku form, we talk about sparks and the friction there. But, like, always thinking about, like, where can I take this? Where can I go? Like, looking for surprising doors you didn't know were there, and then enter those doors and see what's sort of in the other room. Colin Sandberg says, since this is a self-portrait, perhaps the painter can take a step back from the painting and the poem can go on from there. Chelsea McClellan says, I do wonder if the poet is currently 15, as I would add extra encouragements to keep going, keep this advice in mind. That's true too. I mean, if the poet is 15, it's really wonderful stuff for a 15-year-old as far as the details go. Okay, let's look at the other poem from Carla. And that'll maybe give us a clue. The Darkness is next. The Darkness. This is what it teaches me. I listen because it weighs me down like a tempest wind force. I stay inside because I know. It whispers that it will protect me in the smallest hours, that I am safe only in its clutches, but oh, how it lies. It watches me with vulture-like eyes and follows me like a stain to the skin. In the wasting of the night, he will come for my power, unhinge his jaw, and swallow me whole. So again, tough topics, this one from a more abstract perspective, the darkness coming up and being personified. So there's something that's nice about the perfectly shaped prose poem, perfect rectangle, and then all of the lowercase everywhere. That does feel nice, I think. A lot of times, lowercase and sort of that kind of thing feels sloppy in a poem. But if you have it presented well, plated, as we like to say, like a dish of food, where there's something conscientious going on in the presentation of the poem, then I think then it can work nicely as a contrast and a way to make the poem have a certain feel. I think it actually works in this one. The Darkness. The Darkness. And so Dick Westerman says, I don't think the poet is 15. This feels to me as if the poet reflects on the crisis of being 15, having been violated as a young person. Yeah, and if that's the case, as someone was saying, Colin, I think, and Lisa were saying, maybe looking back and having new perspectives in that last poem. But the darkness, this is what it teaches me. So we have the darkness being personified. I listen because it weighs me down like a tempest wind force. And I think like a tempest wind force, a tempest is like a wind force, so that feels redundant to me. I stay inside because I know it whispers that it will protect me in the smallest hours, that I am safe only in its clutches, but oh, how it lies. And I think that's an interesting concept of being safe only in the clutches of the darkness itself is personified like negativity and depression, and the safety and the comfort of that is an interesting concept to explore even more in a way like this. It watches me with vulture-like eyes. It follows me like a stain to the skin. And so we get the vulture-like eyes, we get the stain to the skin, which is kind of interesting. In the wasting of the night, he will come for my power, unhinge his jaw, and swallow me whole. And so I think, again, like other stuff we've seen today, this could be developed a lot more. There's a lot of potential here in the concept of personifying the darkness, and also that idea of feeling safe there within the darkness. I think that was the most interesting part of the poem, and what is worth exploring and digging into deeper. And so that would be my advice here. I think the poem has a great sort of nugget in there that we can expand on. But again, like the last poem, it sort of puts itself out and then stays in the same place. Amy Dower Solorza says, I think there is maybe too much mixing of metaphors. Darkness, a tempest, a vulture, a monster. Things end up in a kind of there's an uncanny valley between saying something and sticking to one thing, or letting things shift a lot and being sort of shape-shifting and strange, and having sort of like a montage of different things all combining. So I can see the darkness being described in a whole lot of different ways that don't add up together if it's enough. Or sticking with the darkness is this indecipherable thing too. You can go either way, but when you have just a few, it feels really confusing because you don't know whether to stick with the one train or go. And so having the darkness being just this sort of blob of dark, and then having the vulture-like eyes is a sort of mixing that we need either more or less of it. And Elizabeth Brown says, would like more. And I think that's true. She's talking about stains. Nice sound, stains, wasting, would like more. But in general, I think just more in total. There could be a lot more, it's a great concept with more to explore. And I think let's push it farther and see where it takes us again, which is, I guess, the theme of today. It's not enough to have an idea and put it down on paper. We want to have an idea that triggers more ideas and more leaps and takes us a surprising place. And it's not enough to have one thought on the page. It's those extras, the farther that we are pushed by our creative energy, which is really the spirit of humanity, is our ability to do that. And so pushing beyond the original thought is something that is the arc of the poem. That is like the plot. If it were a novel, it would have this arc. The arc of the poem is pushing forward new ideas and taking new leaps and coming to places we didn't know. Let's look at one more poet before we go. And next up we have Jessica McKendry from Australia. Let's see. So it's one poem. And there's a long question, so let's read this. I wrote Summer in August 2019, originally planning to enter in a poetry competition which had the word summer for the starting prompt. It was the winter at the time, and I crafted the summery feeling, so I started waxing on the theme of the season, and it turned into a story about summer personified. I have two versions, the first written with U.S. towns, which I'm unfamiliar with, and the later version written with Australian towns, many of which I know well. For reasons that I have faded from memory, I didn't enter the competition, but I have remained fond of the poem. Been edited several times over the years. However, I've always struggled with how to best format it so that the rhythm and the voice comes through, as I tend to have jagged, uneven line lengths. I'd also be delighted to hear your thoughts on which verses feel extraneous, but how one can properly decide on which parts ought to be condensed, etc., as brevity is not one of my writerly virtues. P.S. Apologize about not including a second poem option. I refrained from adding a second, as this one is quite long, plus my other poems feel rather too personal and emotive for usable for a critique. Yeah. So it's a lot to say here. Let's see how long the poem actually is. It is pretty long. But let's see. So this will be the last poem for today. It's a long poem, but with short lines. So we'll see how it actually goes. And it with an eye toward the things that Jessica mentioned. Okay. So this is Summer. And interesting to talk about there's certain effects of lines, and having a lot of variable lines has a kind of effect. A little bit more, poems tend to feel a little more casual that way, and they tend to, and so if you're trying to cultivate a voice like that, so if you look at someone like Charles Bukowski, it feels like he's just scratching off poems, even though he was actually working and reworking them. It feels like he was just sort of scratching them off, which makes things feel more intimate in a way. Like there's just not a lot of, I'm just being honest, I'm just putting all on the table. It's kind of the vibe when you have a poem like that. It also does affect the rhythm because you read lines at different speeds based on the length. It's just a natural way that we read, because every time there's a line break, there's a little, even though we try to, we do run through to the end of the line in the enjambment. It is like a pause no matter what, because we do come to the end of the line. So there's a pause, so it slows it down every time. So that highlights words. So that's what the structure is going to do. And let's see if that works here as we go through the story and any other ways we can help with this poem of Summer. I think this is Jessica McKendry from Australia. Also, I think other thing, she mentioned having American towns in one version that she didn't know, and I would just stick to what you know, like stick to what you're familiar with, and the poem will feel more authentic, because I think it's worth doing instead of using American towns for some reason. All right, Summer. I saw the boy come into the classroom, saw him stand against the morning light and look to the rafters, breathing deep, mature, hardy, robust, hale and lusty as a sheep's farmer's son. He walked, ambled, swaggered, sauntered, tripped, stumbled, strolled, lilted, walked into the room, and I tasted a breath of birds overhead, white beaches, watermelon, miniskirts, and linen blouses, popcorn, hot bitumen, fresh-cut grass, and hummingbirds whipping through the tendrils of my thought. So it's an interesting start there. I think we're going to talk about it more as we go, because there's a long poem. But there's good details to start out the poem. I'm interested about it. It's sort of there's a hyperbolic nature to this first section, and interesting details. So I'm curious to see where this is going to go. He dived swallow-tailed down the corridor to my open heart. I dropped a book on his foot. He laughed, asked my name, asked my number, asked if I had seen the sunrise over Circular Quay. Classes are useless in summer. No one listens, no one cares, not when the sun is so vivid in the grass, not when the sky is so open and clean. He glanced across the desks, in his eye the gleam of an expert truant. So he ran, as truant children do, in delighted half-terror of capture. Along the sun-struck grass, we scampered to the park where children inched and skidded down plastic slides prickling with heat. We chalked hopscotch on the pavement and scrawled topsy-turvy round its edges, secrets in pink chalk, quickly scuffed away by bashful feet. We raced to the fountain, watched it churn, fished for pennies in the water, discovered that to be wet to the elbows is a funny, pleasant feeling. Cartwheels turning in the saturated brightness, his tawny skin glistened like a new penny, deep-toned scarlet umberbrush. Come, I said, and led him a merry dance. Through the glare, suburban neighborhoods stared at the two of us, gamboling over their prosaic lawns with goblin glee to the pool that beckoned. And oh, it was ecstasy, to dive and break the glassy surface, the first shock of cold water like a blow to the face, to splash and soak the steps and in the shallows, to sip lemonade through straws blue and white, and forget responsibility for one eternal day. We listened, appraised, argued over music, sports, games, food, philosophy, life, anything and everything. In the evening light we bared our souls in a game of truth or dare. I always chose truth. My father said the dare reveals more than even two truths. It means you're hiding something, and I had nothing to hide. In the glowing purple and vermilion dusk we drifted in water that was like liquid nectar poured through the hands of Midas. Summer touched his golden beard. Do you still, as if I had never not, want to see the sun rise on Circular Quay? I rode my bike on night deliveries with Coke and pizza for fresh, hungry hordes in crowded, smoke-filled dorms until I'd saved enough to buy 3 cotton shirts, 2 denim skirts, and sand shoes for Circular Quay. At last, one morning, I slid into his battered ute, smelled the heated rubber of the wheel. Excitement burst from our skin. The engine slurred and rattled into a steady roar. Against my knee, a speaker thumped the summer hits. Are you ready for Circular Quay? Rockhampton farewelled with us. Swaths of mosquitoes. Bundaberg flickered, waned, and passed on. We busted a road sign in 8-mile plains, drove into Southport on 2 flat tires. At Burley Heads, we unloaded the tent, and I rode the foam-capped ridges of towering green, rode them crashing into the hard, glittering sand. We kissed in the beach grass and slept on the dunes because he said he was tired. Sweat and lathered sunscreen, nostrils burned by salt, tired feet, itching blisters from rubber Crocs, warm, drowsy skin, neck and shoulders, his breath upon my cheek a kaleidoscopic flare. That night he woke, coughing, a cough with a hitch to it, a violence that racked him chest to toe. I'm fine, he whispered, smoothing his pain with a fist tightly clenched. We must get to Circular Quay. Morning saw him, smiling, affectionate, mildly sarcastic, older, a change that I puzzled over. One more day to Circular Quay. I stopped at a fruit stall on the way through Coffs Harbor. I bought him peaches to match his burnt shoulders. I bought him sweet corn and feathery dill. Between my palms I crushed the dill, and it rained down on our heads like green confetti for the homecoming of a king. Grapes besought his fancy. Next we ate them in greedy luxury, reclining like Romans, devouring great bunches, ripe, smooth, succulent, bursting cold and fresh down our throats. The coast road, excited or suffocated by turns, beach fires, and flame-grilled steak, burned-out tires, burnt-out motors, margaritas and beer, ice-clinking mint leaves floating in passion-fruit punch, a glade of pines, a grove of nectarines, a garden nursery, row upon row of emerald, indigo, saffron, vermilion. He bought me a giant posy, roses, asylum, violets, a drooping, sleepy bunch. With large and gentle devotion he gathered them, he named their names, and each had a delight for him, peculiar to itself. I stroked the ruffles of their dresses and kissed where the clean leaves pricked and scratched. In quiet scorn, the pretty things drew back, twitching their skirts away, withering slightly at the edges, and then I understood that I would never be to Summer what these flowers were to him. Fresh scones slathered in cream and plum jam in a roadside cafe before the final 3 hours. Had the sky always been this blue? No, never. Only for us, only for today. Can you drive? I'm tired. Tired? Fear gripped my heart with ice-swollen fingers. He swapped seats and traded stories. I watched a slow, deadly listlessness veil his limbs, but like the final bright glow of a dying flame, he waxed fierce and passionate, as if he knew what was coming. He spoke about the histories intertwined with every town, his verbal praise and enthusiasm pouring, gushing, flowing as tree sap cut to the quick. Then he spelled out desire and despair, spoke as if the sands of time were dwindling to naught, as if we had so little time. I told him we had forever, but he frowned, tossing back his golden mane. I paused. A pause. His voice rumbled on again, low and uncertain, hands immobile in his lap, blue eyes mirroring the cloudless blue day, sweet and shivering. Port Macquarie, Newcastle, Gosford, we drove into Sydney just after 3. Here, in the blaring, oppressive streets, a towering skyline of steel shrinks the sky into a patch of starless gray. But the sun must rise soon, and we will see it today. Though the air reeks of corrosion and gum and wet concrete, and the tang of chemicals upon the tongue is like 20 needles driven into a sponge. We found a pylon, he cradled my hand, a hurt bird nestling deeper into a bush, curling up into a tight and weary ball, two forlorn children waiting for a sunrise that never came. The sky was like acrylics muddied by an inexpert hand, like great mildew brooms overrun. Slick and dark, the waves that lapped the shore, drinking up twine and plastic rings and crumbs of styrofoam and belching dead things. Beneath the promenade, he sagged against my chest and sickened. Lungs degenerated, terminal. The doctor shrugged, plastered on a patient smile. These things happen every day. Nothing to be done. A stranger joined me at the hospital bed, addressed the sufferer tenderly, touched his chilled fingers, looked at the wasted face, a man with eyes unbearably like summer. His brother like enough, or half-brother maybe, gentler, softer, richer, bashful, airborne hair like tufted robin's breast, care lined his brow, blood his sleeves. He battles hard, mused the copper-headed stranger. Battles hard for the things he loves. He can rest. His time has run its course. In the final agonies, we sat on each side of this one we loved. Hold my hand, go, gentle brother. And he breathed, sagged, ached, breathed, wept, sobbed, breathed, fought, raged, fell. Tranquil, resting. One breath more. He went gently. In the corner stood a hoary, withered man, clutching at frost-capped knees, and by his side a young one, a great wound blossoming in their chest, skin white as paper, eggshell thin, tender, raw, blighted, weeping till the grave. I walked home in the rain, in mud-splashed stockings, weeping long after the grave. Yeah. So this is interesting. There are a lot of comments. I could only see them out of the corner of my eye as I read, obviously. But to me, the poem does... it drifts and moves a lot. There's really great details. And when when it's moving through great details, saying them in interesting ways, the poem is really lively and alive, and I really feel engaged. And I think that's the thing that's working the most. I like the I like the structure of it too. I think what we were talking about with this sort of feel like it's casual but not at the same time, there's a little bit more intimacy to it. I think it works nicely with the pacing too, to have the lines varied like that, so I wouldn't worry about that at all. The whole arc of the poem, though, is a little bit hard to follow, and it feels like it does go on too long, and yeah. So... Yeah. Amy Dower Solorzano says, so much wonderful material, but there is no time to linger on anything, so the effect is numbing. More curation will let us hold on to the best, stickiest images. And yeah, so trimming that back, there was a refrain, the going to the quay that came through, the circular quay. And it feels like there's like multiple poems living within this poem. Like it can't decide which way to tell the story. And so one of the versions has like the circular quay be this refrain that comes back where every stanza or something ends with the circular quay. And so if that was the whole poem, or maybe, there are other poems that have different sections that work in different ways. I'm trying to think of an example of that, but there are examples where, one section will have, but like sectioned off kind of, and will be written in different forms. That's a possibility. But it sort of does feel like the whole kitchen sink is thrown into this poem, and and it also has those lists of verbs too. And so I think condensing, and how do you figure out what to condense? You listen for where you're getting bored and where the things are interesting you. And so using yourself as like a feedback monitor, and I can feel where I'm getting less interested, in the poem, and other parts that I'm engaged. So the other thing that I'm confused about is just the general plot and the way we move through time. I feel like it needs a kind of device to organize time, so we know where we are, maybe at the start. It's told in a kind of linear progression, in chronological order of what happened in the story itself. But we don't have any kind of frame for that, and so it's hard to keep track of like how long things are going on. Like, did this happen? It's over the course of a summer. I guess. And so, it's like 3 months of action takes place here. But it's a little hard to follow that aspect of it. And so having some kind of way of, having a narrative that occasionally comes back from a current position might be helpful. Or just managing time a little bit more would make the poem a little easier to follow too. Winston Munn says, in this particular poem, I felt the circular quay was used too often. Yeah, I mean, it didn't really make sense to use it that often, unless it's the kind of thing where you're going to refrain through the whole poem or something, which would be a totally different poem. So that's what I mean by there's, Laura M says quay is pronounced as key. Okay, thanks. I didn't realize that. Winston Munn says an explanatory title would help. I think summer sets the time period, at least. But yeah. But that would help more. But the main thing is to shorten it up and make it feel not so long. And how to do that is notice the things where the poem is not working as well. And I think really having a kind of more of a frame. There's a lot of ways that it's interesting how this works, and then comes back at the very end. There are just so many possibilities for how to take it's like it's the whole kitchen sink of poems within one. Zoe Torrance says it could be broken into multiple poems, one for each scene time frame. Let's see. Look at some others. Ali Rowland suggests reworking it as flash fiction. Winston Munn says, is every word add? I think no. Yeah, and a lot of great work, but desperately could use some compression. Yeah. And so there were times, let's see, and I got to get going, but there were times where the poem, I don't know. I mean, I wonder if we could stick more to the story itself and just have it be one, like, continuous and not have the death hospital stuff be an explanation and have it more like what we wondered about. Maybe have that be explained in the title, and then so we kind of forget. I don't know. It just needs sort of more framing so we have a sense of the pace, and then to be like 2/3 the length maybe, and so cut out the stuff that's not necessary. It's a long poem. It's hard to critique longer poems because it's a lot to go through twice, and I don't have time. I got to run, but that's my thoughts on that poem. And there are a lot of comments throughout. So everybody, if Jessica can go through and look at the comments. All right. Well, we got to go. That is going to wrap up the show for this week. Thanks, everybody. Hope you enjoyed it this early time. And this week coming up on the Rattlecast, the guest is going to be Joseph Millar. So Joseph's a wonderful poet. He's Dorian Lux's husband, who Dorian was the guest 2 months ago, and Joseph had a new book coming up too, so we brought him on as well. It's Shine. He's just a wonderful poet, great teacher of poetry. Looking forward to reading more of his work. That's Joseph Millar. The prompt for this week was I have to look it up again. I have no recollection whatsoever. The prompt for this week was to pick a photographic portrait featuring someone you know or don't know personally and write a short poem that explores their story. So there's a lot of details in there. So write a photographic portrait. Pick a photographic portrait featuring someone you don't know personally and write a short poem that explores their story. So I didn't even notice that the short was in there. So write a short poem that explores their story. And interesting, a lot of ways you can go about that. That is the prompt for this week. The guest is Joseph Millar. Should be a lot of fun. The regular time, Sunday, November 3rd, 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific. Hope to see you there. Hope you have a great weekend. I should also say we dropped an episode of the Poetry Space just moments ago because they come out at noon. That's Katie Dozer's show. I co-host. We talked about divorce poems. We had a lot of fun last night after all the Halloween trick-or-treating going on. We sat down and recorded a podcast and just shared a lot of really fun poems and fun poems about divorce, if that's possible, and talked about that. So do check that out as well. And then tune in to the Rattlecast 268 this Sunday. Hope to see you there. Hope you have a great weekend, and we'll talk to you later. Goodbye.